Very good morning to you once again if you're just joining us onto this concerning situation now, and it has to do with the Limpopo schoolgirl who assaulted a learner, Lufuno Mabunga, which is suspected may have led to Lufuno Mabunga taking her own life, and the alleged perpetrator has been charged with assault and is currently in custody. The matter has sparked outrage across the country, with many calling the issue of bullying in schools to be addressed. Teddy Bear Clinic and the stabbings that have gone on, whether it be vehicle accidents, attempted suicides or drownings and assaults by bullies, are triggered by trauma among school pupils. And this seems to be the argument that is mounted by the Teddy Bear Clinic, and Dr. Shaheda Omar is the director with the Teddy Bear Clinic. Let's also introduce the other guests. Advocate Vuyokazi Ketelo, who is from the NPA and specializes in child justice. And also we are in conversation with Lithalethemba Stwayi, an attorney from the Center for Child Law. My thanks to you all for joining me for this important discussion. I want to start with you, Advocate Vuyokazi Ketelo. You are with the NPA. Talk to us about a recent case. This is a court outcome that came out of KZN, and it dates back to the issue of a learner who bullied another and actually assaulted the other learner. That particular child has now been sentenced to 12 months, and community service is what she is going to be doing to try and pay for her crime, so to speak. Do you think that that particular punishment is appropriate for someone who is still a child, so to speak?
Thanks, Collie, and thanks for your viewers. Yes, I think that particular punishment is okay for a child, because you remember, as we're dealing with children that are in conflict with the law, we follow the provisions of the Child Justice Act, which says that we need, when we are dealing with these children, we need to rehabilitate them and reintegrate them back into their communities. Therefore, we use those particular sentences so that we can make sure that they are accountable for what they have done. So as the child is going through that particular sentence, in a way, we want her to be accountable for what she has done, to learn that whatever that she has done, it's not something right in the society. And also we are rehabilitating them and reintegrating them into the community.
All right. Dr. Omar, your sentiments, is this an appropriate sentence that will ultimately lead to this child being rehabilitated for what she has done?
So to understand, we always look at what is in the best interest of the child. And in this case, I think falling under the Child Justice Act, it speaks clearly to diverting children, giving children a second chance in life, and to ensure that they are not subjected to secondary trauma or secondary victimization, where they are locked up in cells and they have to be faced with brutal arrests and interrogation, I think, and obviously be subjected to that kind of harm. So looking at this scenario, yes, we cannot condone the actions of the child, and we need to ensure that children understand that actions have consequences, that there's appropriate, acceptable behaviors and inappropriate and unacceptable behaviors, provided that this is not harmful to the child. I think more than rehabilitation, it's looking at supportive measures, interventions, therapeutic support provided not only to this child, but to the broader system, where parents and caregivers are also provided that kind of intervention. And this is a community-based intervention, meaning that the child would continue to remain in the care of the parents. So in line of what has been meted out, it is justified, it is accepted, provided there is no further harm or trauma induced on the child.
Yeah. Ms. Stwayi, talk to us about, you are from the Center for Child Law. I just want for you to quickly give us a quick interpretation of the Child Justice Act. What does it provide for in very plain language?
So the Child Justice Act basically regulates the criminal justice system for children. And one of the biggest of it is restorative justice. So I agree with Dr. Omar. Basically, crimes are divided into three categories, from your less serious to your more serious. With this particular child, assault with grievous bodily harm is a Schedule 2 offense. So the Child Justice Act will then work according to the specific schedule. She has been appearing in court. The proceedings will happen in camera, meaning it will be behind closed doors. Only the people that need to be there will be there. For example, her attorney, her parents, the victim's parents, the probation officer, who's the social worker assigned to this case, as well as the magistrate.
All right. Let's come back to you, Advocate Ketelo from the NPA. So as the case that is unfolding in Limpopo is now underway, what are you aiming for in that particular case? What would you say is your ultimate goal there?
At this point in time, we cannot say, as you are rightly saying, that the matter is in court, because what is going to be what has happened already is that the child has appeared to what we call preliminary inquiry. The purpose thereof is to get the personal circumstances of this child through a probation officer. So we have done that. The matter is going to go for bail application. So once we go through that, there are many things that a prosecutor that is dealing with this matter at court level can do. A child can be diverted only if the child meets the requirements of diversion. As Doctor was talking about diversion, they must meet requirements. For example, the child needs to acknowledge responsibility, that I acknowledge that what I have done is wrong and I take full responsibility of that. And many other things. The prosecutor himself or herself must consent to that particular diversion, and the parents must also consent to say that I agree that my child must be diverted. Or if the child doesn't meet those requirements, then the matter will go now to the formal criminal justice system, where the child will go on into a trial. But then what we looked at first and foremost, and the Act is saying we're looking at diverting these children, but then that depends on whether the child does meet the requirements of diversion. And the child will be diverted into a program that will assist that particular child, because a probation officer's report will tell us what are the circumstances of the child, why did this child commit this particular offense or not. So we'll take it from there and see how best do we move with this particular matter, as it is already in court right now.
And you mentioned personal circumstances as part of what you are going to consider moving forward. Are you at liberty at all, Advocate, to tell us what the circumstances, personal circumstances of this child that is now behind bars as a result of Lufuno Mabunga's death? Simply, I'd like to know whether part of your work goes into the background of this child, the kind of home that they come from.
Yes, the work will be looking at that, in particular the probation officer's assessment report, because they assist us with this assessment report to look at the background of this particular child, also inform us of the age, which is very crucial when we are dealing with these children, because once you get to know the age of a particular child, you also get to know whether the child does have criminal capacity or not. And when we speak about criminal capacity, we are looking at whether the child can differentiate between right and wrong. A child can appreciate the wrongfulness of the act and act accordingly with that particular appreciation. So the probation officer's report will be able to tell us exactly what are the personal circumstances of that particular child. Then moving from that, we are able to know how do we move in this particular matter.
Dr. Omar, generally speaking, and I use those words carefully, I've chosen them carefully, generally speaking, the children who find themselves in this kind of situation, what kind of homes do they usually come from?
Well, I mean, you know, the children that we have worked with on the ground, children who tend to bully or victimize other children, we have experienced that they come from dysfunctional backgrounds, or they've been subjected to victimization or bullying themselves, where they have been, been compromised either in the home environment or in any other external environment. And what we often say is that it's easy to jump to labels and blame and shame the child and humiliate the child and say that that's a bad child or that's a mad child. But actually, if we unpack those layers, we often find that there's actually a very sad child crying out for help. This is symptomatic of underlying unresolved and unmet emotional needs. That's the one side of the coin. And the other, the flip side of the coin, is that children that feel worthless, helpless, hopeless, and who have a low self-esteem are also seeking in a maladaptive way for recognition, for validation. And obviously, because they're not getting it, this is their attempted solution of assuming the sense of power and control. So you see this dynamic playing out itself out in an environment where they then prey on other more vulnerable, their age mates or peers or people in the immediate social circle. So I think this is something that we also need to be aware of, that we need to realize that these are both children, the victimizer and the victim. Whilst we're not condoning the actions of the victimizer, we also, as the advocate clearly articulated, we need to actually delve into the circumstances and look at what can we do in terms of assisting this child, in terms of disrupting and breaking this cycle of abuse, and look at relapse prevention in the long term. And children who receive support and intervention, therapeutic intervention, are in a more favorable position to prevent that from recurring.
All right. Well, you heard at some point during this discussion the word or the phrase restorative justice. So when we return, we're going to ask Lithalethemba Stwayi about the victim. What about the victim, and what needs to happen with them? How should they be coping with this situation? We'll do that after the short breather. Very good morning to you. If you're just joining us, we are in discussion with a number of guests this hour, and it's all got to do with how should we take care of the issue of bullying in our schools. And Lithalethemba Stwayi, you from the Center for Child Law, and just before we went on a break, I spoke about restorative justice, which is what has been mentioned during the course of this discussion. And of course, that then places the victim at this center. I always want to use living examples when discussing complicated matters like this. So if we go back to the KZN situation, that particular child who's now been sentenced to community service for 12 months, part of what they need to do, or part of what the court order instructs them to do is to go and apologize to the victim. What happens if that is not carried out by the perpetrator?
So with having that as part of the court order, if the offender doesn't actually follow through with that, either they go back to court and a different sentence is then provided, because the sentence that she was given, which is the community service, has to go with the apology. And that goes with restorative justice, taking accountability, making amends, preventing reoccurrence of the offense, and then reconciliation of the offender into society. But it also takes into account the victim, because in that case, there probably was a victim statement provided to the court regarding how the victim actually felt about the offense that occurred to them and what basically they required from this particular situation. Hence, the apology was part of the court order.
Yeah. So if we look at the Limpopo situation then, we know that right now things are still sub judice, if you will. What would the approach be in that situation? We're now talking a completely different set of circumstances. A person has died. What would generally be the expectation from a person who is seen as being responsible for this death?
So the alleged offender is imprisoned for the assault. So she's facing trial for the assault of the victim.
Yeah.
The passing of the victim was an unfortunate consequence of how the victim felt about the actual assault. So I think part of it would be the fact that now the offender who thought she was just assaulting the victim did not particularly think that it would end this way. And bullying happens all the time in our schools, in our society. So one thing now that she has an added consequence of is the death of her schoolmate. And that is one thing that she has to kind of go through life with. Firstly, whether she takes responsibility or not, it's a big factor that this is what, because we can't get a victim statement, so it's a big factor that the victim actually passed away.
Yeah. But
going back to restorative justice, you can hope that the offender takes responsibility, whichever punishment is meted to her, whether she has community service, whether she's diverted out of the criminal justice system, whether she has to serve a bit of time in a child and youth care center. She learns her lesson. She doesn't reoffend in this manner or in any other manner. And you hope that when all of this is done, they are a better individual, they're a better child, they're a better adult once they reach adulthood.
Yeah, okay. And it's quite interesting what you have said. And I want to come to you, Advocate Ketelo from the NPA. And I stand under correction here. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. The parents of Lufuno Mabunda, I think they said that they do not necessarily want to see this child who physically abused their child going and sitting in jail, because they are a child and there is still so much that can be expected from them. Is that something that you will take on board as prosecutors when you pursue the case against the alleged perpetrator?
Definitely, Koli. It's something that we will consider, because we are required actually in terms of the law to consider the views of the victim and his or her parents. So it's something that we'll be considering. And what you are asking, I like it, because it goes back to what Ms. Stwayi was saying about restorative justice, because we had similar cases like that one where the victims are saying, I'm not interested in the whole criminal justice system, but we want this child offender to be assisted. So it's something that we will be considering, because we are actually required in terms of the law to consider the views of the victims. What are the views in this particular case? And then we take our decisions once we've done that, because we need to consider the views of the victim, the views of the investigating officer as well. So those are the things that we are considering before we can reach a decision in any particular matter concerning a child that is in conflict with the law.
Yeah.
So that is correct.
Dr. Omar, the alleged perpetrator in the case of Lufuno Mabunga, who is now in custody, what responsibility, if any, should they take for their child's actions?
Well, I think firstly we need to appreciate and recognize that this is a child. She is a minor, and we need to look at healing, not harming children. And the fact that the victim suffered a tragic death, that is something that would also impact on this child's life. The survivor guilt and all other possibilities of destroying her psyche, her emotional and mental being. The intention was not to heal the child. So I think the responsibility of the family, of the caregivers, is to assist and support this child in the process of healing and whatever is required, because as my colleagues have articulated, that with the information provided by the probation officers, the social workers, and all other professionals, the criminal capacity report speaking to the mental state of the child as well, will all contribute towards the interventions and ensuring that this child gets the necessary help and healing opportunities. And I think that is the responsibility of everybody, not just the family or the parents, but it's a multi-professional response to supporting this is also a victim, the victim of other adversities or situations or circumstances, and we cannot look away from that. That, as my colleagues have illustrated earlier on, according to the Child Justice Act, that this child falls under that and would require the opportunities of giving this child a second chance in life, instead of throwing the key away, locking that child up, and then developing a fully blown or potential adult offender. This is an opportunity to help, heal, and disrupt and break that cycle of abuse.
All right. Let me come to you, Ms. Stwayi, from the Center for Child Law. And this is not to suggest in any way that the next question I'm going to ask you is something that is present in these two cases that we have spoken about. But is parental alienation something that is provided for in the child law?
So parental alienation, basically the action of one parent in not allowing the child to see the other parent, it's not necessarily provided for, but there are ways to stop that from happening. So from the Children's Act, if a father wants access to their child and the other parent is stating that, no, I won't let you see your child, they can go to either the family advocate's office or they can go to the children's court and have a magistrate presiding over the matter, and a parenting plan can be made. And if the other parent still continues to stop the other parent from seeing the child, then they can face either a fine or prison time.
Yeah.
So there's around it.
Has it ever been found? Has it ever been found to be an issue in, I suppose, many of the cases that you have come across? Has it ever been something that is seen as part of the cause of why a certain child behaves in a fashion that is just almost criminal?
I won't necessarily say parental alienation. In some cases, parents are absent. In some cases, parents are the ones that cause the trauma. For example, children with disruptive behavioral difficulties such as conduct disorder who are more inclined to do criminal acts or assaults, or mental illness, underlying adolescent mental health. That has not necessarily been established, because it's very difficult to kind of pin down what a child might be suffering from, and if it's happening in schools, teachers are not equipped to kind of identify those things. That's why it's important to have an intersectoral system where you have social workers in schools who can actually, by just observing the child, their behavior, that can actually spot that something is not all right here, and they can have those early interventions before we actually get to the most serious things.
All right. Final question, and this is a question I'm going to ask you, Advocate Ketelo, and indeed Dr. Omar. In the NPA, or in the cases that you've dealt with thus far, because I suspect some people, as I strongly believe as well, that if you as a parent have not been a responsible parent, and as a result your child is doing or is behaving badly out there, you also ought to take responsibility. Have you ever been faced with a situation where you need to jail the parent for the actions of their child?
Yes, Koli, there are cases like that, when the child comes in as a child who has committed a particular offense, but through the investigation that I spoke about earlier from social workers, probation officers, you see that this child is a child that is in need of care and protection. That means that the parents are not there, the parents are not taking care of these children. Therefore, that's why this child is committing offenses, because they are in need of care and protection. Just maybe to give an example of that, if the parent is not there, if the parent is a parent that is an alcoholic, for the lack of a better example, you know, the child, the only thing that they will know is to go out and steal bread, for example, because I'm hungry, my mother is never there. So we say those children are in need of care and protection in terms of the Children's Act. So what we'll do in those children, we will refer their matters to the Children's Court so that they can be assisted there, you know, they can be counseling and calling upon now the parents to be part of the upbringing of their children. And if parents, we have parents that are refusing and saying that I do not want anything to deal with that particular child, then in those particular circumstances, we can use the provisions of the Children's Act to say that you are actually abandoning your child, you are not taking care of your child. Therefore, there can be some time of imprisonment or fine, as it is provided for in the Children's Act. So we do come across cases like that. But of importance is that once we find out that the child is in need of care and protection, we refer now the matter to the Children's Court so that it can be dealt there, not to proceed with the formal criminal justice system. So we assist those children in that way.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. Dr. Omar, very briefly, that very same example that's just been used by Advocate Ketelo, how many such cases do you come across, and how do you deal with them where a parent is an alcoholic and just irresponsible?
So we see a lot of children. I would say at least 40% of the children that come to us are children coming from a background where there's substance abuse, alcohol and drug abuse. And so these children are acting out, and as my colleague has articulated, that we would re-divert this to the Children's Court, because these are children in need of care and would definitely require support intervention. But I think we need to understand that the ethos of the Children's Act speaks to the preservation of the family. So we don't want to create further destruction and disintegration. It's about providing therapy to the child in a temporary place of safety or care, and provide support and interventions to the family as well, with the possibility of reunification and reintegration at the end of the day. So I think this is common, but there are ways to work through it, and there have been success stories. Thank you.
Sure. What an interesting discussion this has been. My thanks to you all for making time to talk to us about this very important yet sensitive subject. Dr. Shaheda Omar from the Teddy Bear Clinic, thanks indeed for your time. Advocate Vuyokazi Ketelo from the NPA, and the other important guest, Lithalethemba Stwayi, an attorney from the Center for Child Law. Thank you all for making time to bring us into the picture as to some of the cases that you've had to deal with. Sure, what an interesting conversation.